Bonjour. Good morning to all of you. Welcome to the 33rd session of the Cercle des économistes ex-Assane meeting. I'm Pierre HASKI, work at France Inter. I'm at home. A complex session. 3 people in the studio at the Maison de la Radio, and all the other speakers are with us, but remotely through the video conferencing system. It's a huge program, partnership between Europe and Africa. It's a trite story, and we'll be talking about COVID-19. COVID-19 has worsened the situation. Without further ado, I will give the floor to Mr. de BOISSIEU, the Vice President of the Cercle des économistes. He will give us some background elements, and then I will give the floor to the different speakers. Some of them are in France, and others are in Africa. And I will introduce the different speakers before they take the floor. So, Christian, go ahead. Thank you for being with us. So in Africa, there are lots of things happening, and Europe had a monopolistic status in the past, but now there are other entrants. So if Europe is to be performing and efficient, Europe will have to come up with new proposals. So you have this idea of renewal to change outmoded habits, and I think that there are key principles that we can highlight. 3 principles. First idea, this fresh partnership between Europe and Africa should be balanced, much more balanced than in the past. It has to be tangible and concrete. And third, it has to be funded or co-financed. First idea, it has to be more balanced than in the past. In the field of the monetary domain in Africa, there are interesting things. You have OLECO, the CFA franc is being replaced by ECO for the 15 countries that are part and parcel of ECOWAS. This monetary project, the single currency project, should make it possible to rebalance the relationships between Europe and Africa. Africa should get more currency sovereignty and monetary sovereignty. Second idea, this fresh partnership has to be tangible, concrete. We're not going to have a general global partnership. We want sector-based projects that are practical. Of course, you have military cooperation in these Sahel countries. It's not new. It's been there for a few years. There are 3 avenues that we need to give thought to. A sort of win-win partnership between Europe and Africa. First, co-management between Europe and Africa for migratory flows. The migratory flows will continue unabated in the years to come. In terms of co-management between Europe and Africa, Europe has 2 speakers. One, this prerequisite hasn't yet been materialized, and Africa should speak with one voice. But this is a concrete topic. There are lots of reasons, geopolitical, economic, political, social reasons can underpin this new partnership. Second avenue, education and training. Africa has lots of skillful people, Europe too, so they have to be pooled. So it's important to invest in human capital for Africa and for Europe alike. Third avenue, to renew our partnership. Combating climate change, energy transition. On this front, I think that there are some north-south cooperation initiatives between the two banks of the Mediterranean Sea, but it has to be funded. If you don't have any funding, it will be useless. Europe has taken an interesting, insightful initiative, to propose the cancellation of African debt. Part of it, there are some north-south financial partnerships, but we need to go further. These are three principles that have touched upon concrete, balanced, funded mechanisms. They should be implemented to give a boost to the Euro-Mediterranean partnership. But it is still in its infancy since the 5+5, the Union for the Mediterranean, Euromed, should be given a fresh fillip, a fresh boost, using new cornerstones. And I think that Europe and the African continent could embark upon a fresh relationship, a fresh partnership. These are concrete and practical avenues. Sheikh Kante, are you with us? I can't see him. Sheikh Kante? Can't see Sheikh Kante's screen. Sheikh Kante, are you with us? Are you connected? No. I will give the floor to Carlos Lopez. Carlos Lopez is in South Africa at Le Cap, working for the Commission of the African Union for Partnerships with Europe, and is an academic, an African intellectual. So you have the floor, Carlos. It's pivotal to provide you with some insight into the relationship between Africa and Europe. It's a specific year. There will be a European-African summit. There will be a ministerial meeting in a few weeks, in a few months' time, and then we have COVID-19, the pandemic. So we'll have to consider the relationships between Europe and Africa for the next few years. And there are lots of mental reservations, and there are some limitations, and these limitations are currently being reviewed. So we are talking about agreements binding Europe with other African countries and with Asia-Pacific countries. So this agreement was about to be terminated, had terminated, and there are fresh relations. And you have also the post-Cotonou agreement. And in this regard, there are fields that can only be negotiated by the African Union, talking about different mandates, and talking about peace and security, migration, questions connected with climate change, and trade questions, trade issues. So a free trade agreement being established within the African continent. We want to talk with the different partners of the continent, and we want to speak as one, with a single voice. So that's very important. If you consider our relationship with Europe, there are lots of trade agreements, and the clout of Africa is lessened, and it's difficult to launch a balanced relationship. And I will give you an example. Very often, we underscore the fact that Europe is the leading partner of Africa the 27 European countries, i.e. the EU. The EU is the first trading partner, the first the leading investment partner. And it is true that Europe is the chief partner in terms of development assistance. And if we refer to the transfer of migrants, it is also the first or leading source of migrant transfers. So the relationship between Europe and Africa is strategic. It's also a relationship based on common interests in a multilateral world, but it's a strategic relationship. It depends on the way we sketch this relationship. So what is important is to take on board other significant partners. These statistics do matter, because most of the time we tend to neglect that Africa is the third trading partner of Europe, just behind the US and China. And it's much more important than Latin America and the Caribbean, and 3 times the clout of India, the weight of India. So when we talk about a balance, it's important to underscore these characteristics and features. For Europe, Africa is key. So when we think about Africa, we have in mind development assistance, and development assistance is quite low versus the growth of in GDP, the growth in GDP in Africa. If you consider the COVID-19 situation, Europe provided some assistance to Africa, but it was a matter of rescheduling some funds that were already in the books. Nous sommes désolés, la réception en cabine ne permet plus la traduction. So the relationship should go beyond the exports of non-processed raw materials. So this is what I wanted to tell you in order to set the tone, to set the background, especially if we want to talk about a balanced relationship. Thank you, Carlos Lopez. Thank you for highlighting these data information that are not very well known by the public at large. And we tend to have some biased attitudes towards Africa, so thank you for shedding light on these issues. Ibrahim Assane MAYAKI from Niger. You will talk on behalf of NEPAD, an institute working with the African Union. Just to tell you that NEPAD is the development agency of the African Union. So we instill renewable energy in the rural regions. We are working on transportation corridors. We maintain railways, very practical and tangible aspects that have to do with the topics that we'll be dealing with later on. So Carlos described the content and the significance of the cooperation patterns between Europe and Africa. Allow me to address this partnership and maybe to revisit it. When you have a partnership, it implies that there are some players who have identified a common problem in order to achieve a common objective. But of course, they have to maintain some kind of leeway. So if you consider the crisis, there are some lessons to be learned. There's a fundamental criterion should be highlighted. Relevance. In all the countries buffeted by COVID-19, the concept of relevance is being used by all players, civil society, private sector, and all the rest of it. So are we relevant from an institutional viewpoint? This is a question that is being raised by different stakeholders. And what about our governance systems? Are they relevant or not? And is the partnership between Europe and Africa relevant? So there is a question that we need to address before we take action. You have some tactical discussions. Should we favor digitalization? Should we advocate farming transformation in order to mitigate migration? Should we advocate renewable energies? Should we shed light on industrial transformation that takes into account a green technology? So there are some tactical options, but there's also a strategic level. And when you talk about the strategic level, you have the relevance concept. And I think that the current cooperation patterns are not relevant. First, in the EU, when you have Africa being fragmented across 55 states, it's very difficult to have development. That's why we've been advocating regional solutions. But it will take time. Regional solutions are the best solutions if we are to further development away from national solutions. So Europe has some bilateral agreements, but it's not enough. We need to revamp the whole system. It's important to provide regional solutions to regional issues and questions. Second point in terms of relevance, when you have a continent characterized by a median age of 19, it cannot be managed like any other region of the world, especially when the median age is more than 40 years. One of the key consequences of this crisis on our governance model, they will have to be overhauled, to be revamped in depth. So this is something that we've already witnessed. So there are some interactions between Europe and Africa, between Africa and Europe. All of these interactions should embrace the demographic transition, because the demographic transition is not yet over. And the funding mechanisms of today won't hold water in 10 years' time. So it's important to preempt that situation. We need to think about intelligent and smart solutions, and we should embark on a new form of cooperation patterns. So the interaction between Europe and Africa is essential. And I think that multilateralism has to be fully redefined, rejigged, because it's been on the slippery slope. So Europe and Africa will have to take some actions in order to underpin a permanent partnership. and in so doing, multilateralism will be revamped, because it is inefficient, it is outmoded, it is useless. I'm talking about the current form of multilateralism. So thank you, and for your contribution. I hope that we'll have time to shed light on multilateralism, because you delivered a robust and strong message. Elisabeth Moreno, Vice President and Managing Director of Hewlett Packard Africa, and you are with us from South Africa. You have the floor.
Monsieur HASKI, bonjour à tous. Je suis ravie de faire partie de ce panel parce que ce sont les deux parties.
So I'm delighted to be with you. So when I discovered the title of the theme that we are discussing, I had a smile, but I grinned. Of course, there has been a long history between Europe and Africa. You've talked about violence and asymmetry. You mentioned concrete examples and how this new partnership can be set in motion. But there's another fact that we cannot disregard. You have the slavery trade, colonization, and 4.5 centuries elapsed. And allow me to revisit the historic background, because we can understand why Africans don't trust the objectives of Mrs. von der Leyen. We should build a partnership of equals and to write a new page of a common destiny. Imagine a couple where violence has ruled the roost, and then there are promises of new relations because one of the partner wants to seduce the other. So that's why there is some caution, and all of a sudden, with this new couple, you have one of the partners who will give lots of presents. So this partnership was based on a concept of domination and a concept whereby people were dominated, a common destiny, history, and we've seen that the colonial bonds were transformed into a contractual link. But the hand that gives is above the hand that receives. The relationships have been imbalanced since the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, and Africa was talking only with colonial powers, and Africa decided to open itself to the rest of the world. And when you consider the Lisbon Treaty, other countries joined the EU, and they didn't have any relationships with Africa. But when they joined the EU, they started to work with Africa. The Cotonou Agreement embraced or included a fund of 35 billion euros, and it will stop in 2020. And of course, there are some indicative, regional, thematic, national programs. And there were 5 priorities that were set in this program: green transition, digital transformation, intercontinental free trade, peace governance, migratory mobility, and the flow of people. So you have the Europeans with their European expectations, and Africa wants to bank on a common balanced interests. So these new requirements explain why these agreements are not renewed.
In fact, throughout the history, as the head of European diplomacy said, we no longer need a competition for goodness. We all know that the African soil and subsoil is filled with the resources we need for everyday oil, minerals, diamonds, coffee, cocoa, whatever. And we also know, as Carlos said, that the relationships between the two continents are huge. But this wealth only benefited a handful of Africans, while the others were really exploited. So for a long time, the growth in Africa was about 5 to 7%, while in the rest of the world, there was no growth. Obviously, in Africa, you have to build everything, the infrastructures, the middle class is developing. There are huge possibilities, so one understands why suddenly everybody is interested in this continent. And I believe it's high time that Africa was trying to beg for its position in history, as a former president said. In the other countries must understand, whether they're in the north or the south, that this is no longer the case. We see that the continent is courted by Chinese, Indians, the Gulf countries, the Americans, the Russians are back. We see Franco-African summits, China-African summits, Russian ones, and Great Britain is also trying to strengthen its relationships with Africa. And we see that Africa is being invited to G7 and G20. So this possibility of choosing partners also means that the African leaders have a huge responsibility to establish a better governance and guarantee legally the proper development of the system and business on the continent. Nevertheless, despite these changes, Europe remains the top investor in Africa, the leading aid purveyor, despite the aggressivity of the Chinese. Because obviously, if we have common economic interests, we also have a lot of common challenges: migration, terrorism, climate change, food safety, and these are just a few. So whether we want it or not, our destinies are, as in the past, still naturally linked. But this time things are different. If you think of Mrs. von der Leyen and Mr. Charles Michel, who made their first trip to Addis Ababa with the European commissars, the difference is important, and the relationship of Europe with Africa is changing. But the diversity of countries, of places, the multiple dialogue channels, etc., and the multiple reports, and I've read quite a lot, means it's difficult to harmonize things. Things are competing, which ends up in a restricted result. And there's still a lot of confusion even within the African Union, because most of the heads of states are hanging on to their sovereignty, and sometimes you wonder whether it's not more important than the survival of African citizens. So, well, Africa has gone from an Afro-pessimism to an Afro-optimism. I would just like to be Afro-realistic, explaining what this new relationship between the EU and Africa could be. Well, you must give absolute priority to education. Sorry, madam, I'm going to ask you to conclude quickly. So absolute priority for education, boosting of entrepreneurship, because with a young population like this, if you don't give the Africans the possibility of take hold of their destiny, it will be disaster. Innovation is a major point, because entrepreneurship and innovation go together. You have to guarantee the health of Africans on the continent, and COVID-19 is a challenge to be integrated. And finally, youth. As was said, this continent is the one that has the youngest active population, working population. If we don't help them integrate in an aging world where you need more and more talents, we will have difficulties. So these youngsters are in Europe. They can't find a position in Europe. When they get to Africa, they can't find their place because they are competing with the youngsters who are here. So if I had a magic wand, I would invest in the youngsters in the African continent. Well, thank you very much. I will keep retain your metaphor of attraction and serious partners. I'll give the floor to Vincent, who is CEO of GFI Technological Group. Sir, you have the floor. Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you very much. To pick up on what was said, I do think that Europe is suffering from some liabilities faced with the strong actions of the Chinese, the Indians, etc. We're obviously in trouble. But if I'm going to plead for myself, we feel that the digital sector is a key sector for the creation of a proper partnership above and beyond the demography that is pushing growth, the huge penetration of broadband internet, of cell phones should enable to change the economies and accelerate the path. In about 10 years or a little more, the electronic trade will be multiplied by 10. We see huge changes with hubs where you think of startup Tunisia, Rwanda, Ivory Coast, and other research centers being created. We are present and operate in over 22 countries on this continent with a model which I believe is the one that should be preferred. Rather than extracting resources, we are in a win-win partnership where the growth of the local market born by the rise of the middle class is leading the continent to be both importer and consumer, and has led to an appetite of the stakeholders we heard about and a loss of influence of Europe on this topic over the past 10 years. So we have to reverse the trend, and we are convinced that this partnership relationship should benefit from a win-win situation with all the states in Europe. And this should be led by the digital sector, which should be a vector of transformation. You were talking about the youth, and obviously the digitalization can be a vector for transformation and education of the population, whether you talk about health as well or all other sectors, as the digital technology is impacting all sectors, but it should also support governance. You can change the administration. There's an ability to totally revolutionize the relationships between the government and the populations. And this is obviously a positive element for the settling of the industries such as ours on the continent. Obviously, this should be viewed with a number of risks as well that can be weighed, taking into account governance and everything. So it's important that we relocate some operations on the continent. This was supported by a number of countries. If you think of the transformation of infrastructures, obviously this partnership should look at a more global way at the possibility of working with the continent with an approach such as Smart Africa, for example. So in these new partnerships, stakeholders can work locally and develop an ecosystem with a global vision. This is something we're very interested in, and above and beyond the funding and the more global approaches that have to be implemented, this must be the object of a real focus. I believe that the digital technologies must be the object of a partnership throughout Africa, for example, for public services, which is a link between our populations, our economies, our countries, to accelerate modernization and stimulate democracy. Thank you. Thank you for your contribution. Here in Paris, we have Arnaud, who is the chairman of the Avril group, which is a French agri-food group. Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you for inviting me. I would like to talk, obviously, about things from the angle of agriculture and food, which are very important topics for Europe, but also, obviously, for Africa. The model of the Avril Group is based on farmers, with one promise, one claim. A farmer is anchored in his territory, and he has a trade, a profession, and he must give food to and get his environment to live. And we are convinced that this approach is reproducible throughout the planet, and in particular in Africa. When you put all the stakeholders together, whether they be European or from other continents, there are connections. To get back to the question we were asked this morning, how can we build a partnership? I would like to come back to what are the prerequisites of a partnership. In Africa, you need, as we needed in Europe, you need several things. The commitment of the local stakeholders, to pick up on what Christian de BOISSIEU was saying. You can think of the relationship between Europe and Africa, the traditional one, but I'm part of a generation that really wants to look at the future more than the past. So you have to be anchored locally, and we have very close relationships with cooperatives, groups of farmers in Africa, people from the profession, and they are the people we want to develop with. Second thing, when you want to build a partnership, you need the commitment of states and public policies. It's not enough to have the commitment of the local actors. You need the regulatory framework. Then you need to create lines of business, because you know that if you only focus on one local production, it's not enough. You have to look at the whole line of business, the reality of production, how you can process, store, keep, develop, and also the proximity to consumers. Is it local consumption? Is it export? If you do not have the whole line of business, you won't reach your objectives. Then you also need to know the technologies, the manufacturing and transformation processes, how you can be supported by training, for example. And when you talk about training, I'd like to say a word that we're very happy to be able to rely on the knowledge of a number of engineers from Africa that help us a lot about climate change and how to cultivate in times of warming. So we can benefit from a knowledge that we do not have in Europe about climate warming. Climate warming is bearing heavily on our production. So you see, it's not a one-way thing. There's really an exchange. And there's another factor that's important in the development, the issue of security, safety, and funding. Because if you want to deliver a project, everyone must contribute to the project. It can't be just a one-way funding. Now that I say this, let me be more practical and tell you how Avril, as a group, has developed projects in Africa. And I would like to give you an example, which is that of the relationship developed with Morocco within the framework of Green Morocco, developed by Mohammed VI in 2012. He said, I want to develop my agricultural productions in the plural, because you have large and small farms, and I'm ready to put some public money into it, but I need partners to do that. So we came in, and we were recognized as an aggregator of farmers in the field. We picked up there, but we are working with Moroccan partners, because you need the expertise of the local partners. You need the Moroccan institutions to carry out the project. And what we've noted with this project, which is now called Green Generation, In a little less than 10 years, we were able to multiply considerably the oil crops, to develop the farms, help the farmers get organized as far as crops are concerned, as far as seeding is concerned, as far as everything is concerned. And with all this, the companies can develop, and obviously the Avril group is developing. We're not philanthropists. We want to develop value, but the value is more distributed. You know that a company cannot continue if the suppliers are not sustainable and properly anchored in the territories. And when you think of the African continent and its use, we heard that the median age is 19. You have to understand that we have to massively invest in these youngsters who, if you want them to be able to stay in their territories and not necessarily migrate, or go to the cities. So we have the tools to do something about that. We have the Avril group that is developing industrially, but there are some structural funds in France, like Agropol, which is investing in a number of African countries. And we have a fund as well, a foundation for co-development. It's the Avril Foundation. The idea is to help the local stakeholders to develop so that everybody gains value. And to conclude, I would like to say that in the models that we're going to offer our African partners who are just next door, I'm going to ask them, well, what choice do you want to make? There's several options, as has been said very aptly by the various speakers. We can choose to co-construct, co-build, and I'm thinking in particular about the food sector developed by Avril and other groups, and you can choose the Chinese model, which is quite different. So it's up to the Africans to choose their future. We feel we have something to bring. We feel that there is reciprocity because there is some genius in the way African agriculture is developing with the expertise that, once again, we do not have in Europe. And if we have these type of partnerships, we'll have to make clear choices. For us, it's quite clear, but a number of countries have approached us. Obviously, Senegal, which is why I'm sorry that Sheikh Kanté is not with us. But we're ready to go for it, but we have to work hand in hand with a clear model. Thank you very much for these very practical ideas. Let's try and organize a small discussion amongst you. You ended up talking about China, so I might mix up things, but we have several questions that have come up on China. Elisabeth MORENO mentioned it earlier. How important is the Chinese factor in the equation, and in the factoring in the integration of this factor in a new partnership with Africa? Mrs. Moreno, you talked about the topic. I believe, in fact, you worked for Lenovo. I looked at your personal history, which is a Chinese group that took over from IBM. Can you develop on this idea that you mentioned earlier? I would say that China is extremely present on the African continent and everywhere. China is not interested just in the countries that are most coveted, like South Africa, Nigeria, or Angola. China is very present in all small and big and small countries of Africa. The CEO of GFI mentioned it. The digital transformation is really huge at present. We know that the two major actors in this sector are the Americans and the Chinese are bringing in many things on the continent, both in large and small countries. We know that in this world nothing is for free, so the trade relationships are what they are. As an African, what I feel that the Africans are doing and others are not doing anymore they have a huge local policy. There are a lot of Chinese people living on this continent, a lot of Chinese people working with the Africans and present on the continent and implementing local solutions, contrary to Western countries which try to cut and paste, really, copy and paste. And as the CEO of Avril said, we have to build together and build local solutions and not think that these solutions cannot but come from the outside. And if we want to enrich the local life, there are many local solutions being created in Africa that can also help out the Western countries to face their challenge. Carlos Lopez, maybe. Can you say a word about that? Do you feel that Africa is properly using this asset of having several seducers or people trying to attract it? Yes, obviously, the more the merrier, but really, the Chinese are having a good deal with Africa. I'm sorry, the sound quality in the booth does not enable us to translate properly. Can you repeat, sir, because there was an interruption in the connection and we didn't hear what you said about Chinese investments. Yes, says Mr. Lopez. I was saying that the Chinese are really landing a good deal with Africa because the investments in Africa represent only 15% of what they invest in the world, as much as what they invest in Pakistan. So with very little money, they're occupying a lot of territory. And this is due to the fact that there's been an erosion of European investment, even though it's still there. There's also an erosion of U.S. investment and more of British investment as it's separated from the rest of Europe. So the new stakeholders contribute to a relative increase of the money brought to Africa, but we should really weigh their investment. But the Chinese have a specific strategy. They divide the African countries in various types. A number of countries represent strategic interests for China because of the raw materials found there or the market possibilities. The second group of countries represent for the Chinese an interest that is not strategic, but an interest of occupying the market. And the third group of countries are not really important countries economically for China, but they're important for its reputation. So they spend relatively low amounts in these countries, but in this way they're present throughout the continent and weave relationships and ties that are based on links with the capital cities. But let me introduce another element that is little known and should be remembered. The Africans are also investing in China. In fact, the largest IT company in China, Tencent, the main shareholder is Naspers, which is South African. They hold 30% of Tencent. It's a company based in Cape Town. Naspers. In its participation in China, they have $120 billion in capital, in equity. So you should really weigh this view according to which it's a one-way relationship. A number of things go the other way. If I give you another example, Ethiopian Airlines is dominating the sky between Africa and China, as we could see during COVID crisis. Ethiopian Airlines has 52 flights a week to China, while China only has 4 flights a week to Africa. So you should sort of weigh things properly and not give the impression that Africans are just children that are being handed out gifts from China. Nice image, sir. Thank you. Mr. Mayaki, I'd like to come back to the last point you mentioned when you talked about revisiting multilateralism. Can you and how you think that Europe and Africa can contribute to reinvent this multilateralism at a time when it's more or less a Cold War climate between China and the U.S., a wave that might take away with it everyone, including Europe and Africa? I'm going to answer your question, but before that, I'd like to repeat what Carlos said, i.e., the relationship with Africa and China is absolutely not sentimental. It's a relationship that is based on business, quote unquote. We perfectly understand what the Chinese goals are, and we defend our interests towards China. This is what I note for Africa in general. Now, if you talk about multilateralism, the present multilateralism was organized at the end of the Second World War with the idea in mind of reconstruction. Over the past 10 years, this multilateralism is being deconstructed. There's a kind of Cold War, sometimes more tepid than cold, and a complete collapse of some decision-making process, which makes multilateralism useful. The Council is blocked. The fiscal resources and the financial resources of the UN system are rather limited. You no longer have the strengths of multilateralism as we had 40, 50 years ago. So the partnership built between Africa and Europe should lay the foundations for a new type of multilateralism that can inspire a revision and a revisiting of our whole system, in particular the UN system. I can see three possible directions. The first one, the areas of support between Africa and Europe, and I insist on that, should go beyond bilateralism and be a truly regional approach. Let me explain. When you talk about support for the development of infrastructures through PPPs, this should no longer be a national project, but we should talk about regional projects in order to accelerate the integration of Africa. And I could give you more examples. When you talk about agricultural transformation, you should no longer aim at Togo, Malawi, or Tanzania, but you should sort of target corridors or areas of agricultural transformation that could lead to systems of food reserves. So the support should take on a regional dimension. And this construction based on regional dimension can serve to strengthen the ability of both Europe and Africa to develop this new kind of multilateralism. Second point, African integration will really be dependent on these types of regional integrations. The more integrated Africa is, the more it will hold a geopolitical position in this world that is being built, and the more it will contribute to this multilateralism. Third direction. When you talk about internal relationships within Africa, the social relationships that are aiming at new governance systems, these new systems will go above and beyond the fragmented states that are the present situation. Earlier on, we heard about monetary sovereignty. This will go through these regional blocks. If Africa becomes a regional bloc that is supported by Europe and can play a role on the global scene, in a way we'll see what Japan did with China 50 or 60 years ago. All the Mitsubishi and other Japanese products, in fact, are made in China. The role that Japan played in the industrialization of China was huge. And in a way, this is what enabled the stabilization of these relationships between Japan and China, thereby creating a sublateralism, a multilateralism, which enables the presence of a cooperation between Japan and China that people don't talk much about. I don't know if you know, but when there are summits between China and Africa or Japan and Africa, usually they are followed by the China-Japan summits on the very same topic of Africa. So there is a huge potential in the partnership between Europe and Africa, and there's the potential to lay the basis for a new type of multilateralism, and this would be absolutely fabulous for the other powers. Thank you very much. I have a question from the audience. Very interesting one. Maybe I'll ask you to answer briefly. Is a free trade agreement between Europe and Africa possible, and what are the pros and cons for Africa and for Europe? Who wants to start? Mrs. Moreno? Very quickly. I believe that this free trade agreement could be extremely beneficial for Africa, as then it would then become one of the largest markets in the world. And when I look at what happened in Europe, the European Union is mainly an economic union that worked rather well and helped several European countries develop and hold a global presence. And I believe that if Africa were to create such an agreement, in fact, it's already created, and it's one of the ones that was ratified fastest by the greatest number of African countries, and this is extremely positive and encouraging. I believe if this agreement were to be implemented in the right way, it would be a great asset for the whole continent.
Mr. ROUAIX, let's hear from you. You are an industrialist. We are convinced about that. The ability of Africa to have a global approach. Of course, we can draw a parallel with Europe. It would be a development avenue for Africa and for the furtherance of this partnership between Europe and Africa. In terms of co-development, we will be able to cope with Chinese competition. As Elisabeth said, by way of conclusion, allow me to thank you for your contributions, for your insight. You came up with tangible, insightful comments. I will give the floor to Mr. de BOISSIEU, who kept silent. Yeah, I wanted to show you that I can keep silent. So he will draw some conclusions for us. Thank you for the quality of your observations. You see eye to eye. There are some convergences, but you've stressed different fields and domains, and we need to work together. Europe and Africa should work together. Education, training, youth, digital technology. So the average age in Europe is 40. In Africa, it is 19. So the average age of the European is higher because of my presence. We talked about energy, climate change, but allow me to make a concrete proposal. Ibrahim, Carlos, Vincent, Elisabeth, and all the participants. What you've said is very insightful, but allow me to make a concrete proposal. I think that Africa is underrepresented at the G20. This is something that I've argued the case for. Nigeria or any other African French-speaking country should take part in the G20, and I think that Europe should reduce the number of countries. I think that the Euro zone should be represented only by one country in the G20. We'll have a vacant seat for African countries. So long live competition based on partnerships, a competition where can be better or less bad. So China is very aggressive. This is what you've highlighted, Elisabeth. Moreover, we shouldn't forget our past, but the past should enable us to cast a future-oriented eye. We need to work together, and allow me to use the word that I've used, win-win partnerships and balanced relationships. Thank you for your cooperation, and thank you for this panel discussion.